Welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. Okay, so ever since Fort Sumter, the two sides are at war. Who's gonna win? And I know that we're from the future, and so we know who wins, but that question wasn't as easy to answer in 1860. The Confederacy could sustain itself thanks to its agricultural base. It was fighting mostly on a home field advantage, and the majority of the best trained military officers seceded along with their states. 7 of the 8 military colleges in the US were located in the South, and so their leadership and strategy was far and away better than the North for most of the war. Robert E. Lee will quickly distinguish himself as one of the greatest military minds in history with the way he used his troops so effectively against a much larger enemy. For example, at Chancellorsville, he faced a Union army twice his size. Despite that fact, he divided his army not once, but twice to sneak around the Union forces and attack them from all sides. With only 60,000 troops, he won that battle against an army of 132,000. And sure, he lost his right-hand man, General Stonewall Jackson, but even he was shot by a Confederate friendly fire. The North couldn't even kill Jackson themselves. They had to rely on Confederate soldiers to do it for them. In comparison, the US cycled through generals like they were swiping through bumble dates. Eventually they landed on Ulysses S. Grant, whose battle strategy was less about tactics and more about throwing thousands of men across the battlefield and hoping some of them made it through. Grant fought the war to destroy the South, not just defeat them, and in this way, he foreshadowed the insane numbers and destruction of 20th century warfare. But it's still clear that the South had the advantage when it came to strategy. And most importantly, the Confederates were fighting on the defensive. Remember back to the American Revolution? When the Patriots didn't win, they just kept not losing until the British decided to go home? That's the position the Confederate South was in now. They didn't have to defeat the United States. They just had to defend themselves for long enough that the North decided it wasn't worth it to try to force them to come back to the country. And they knew that European powers were watching and would take notice pretty quickly as global cotton supplies took a hit thanks to the North's embargo of Southern trade. Remember, this is the height of the British Industrial Revolution. All they had to do was wait it out. The US, on the other hand, had to force the South to surrender, a difficult task considering that for most, the war in the South had way more morale and personal motivation. They were fighting in their minds to preserve the Southern way of life, which included slavery, and they were often fighting to defend their homeland. This is partly evidenced by the fact that the South had an army almost equal in size to the North, even though the Southern population was 9 million, compared with the North's 21 million. Southern men joined in droves. It wouldn't be until the Emancipation Proclamation, 3 years into the war, that the North feels a similar drive based on more than just winning the war. By the end of the war, though, over 2 million people fought for the North, compared with just 900,000 for the South. Now, technologically, the North was light years ahead of the South. The Confederacy started the war with 1/9 the industrial capacity as the US. In 1860, the North manufactured 97% of the country's firearms, 96% of its trains, 94% of its cloth, 93% of its iron, and over 90% of its boots and shoes. So the Confederate Army was well trained and determined, but it very well might be naked and unarmed. Northerners felt confident that they would subdue the South pretty quickly. Fair warning, anytime in history you learn that one side thinks the war will be super quick, that normally means the war will not, in fact, be super quick. Wait your turn, World War I. In fact, at one of the first major battles of the war, called First Bull Run by the North and First Manassas by the South, they can't even agree on what to name their battles. Anyway, it was just outside DC, and DC citizens and congressmen followed the troops the 26 miles to the battlefield. Spectators packed picnic baskets and wine as if they were at like a music festival, and they cheered as the 90-day volunteer soldiers marched onto the field. Those volunteers met 22,000 Confederate troops commanded by the most Southern name of all time, General P.G.T. Beauregard. And it didn't go well for the North. Union troops began to withdraw, but they were blocked as half-drunk spectators and carriages clogged up the road back to DC. Luckily, Southern troops didn't follow. They were too distracted by the arrival of President Jefferson Davis on the battlefield. But needless to say, it was super embarrassing for the North. Northerners were like, oh, this is going to be like a real war. For the rest of 1861, troops clashed along a line of 1,200 miles long from Virginia to Missouri. Southerners dug in while Northerners slowly realized that this was going to be harder than they thought. Okay. So we're not going to go through every single battle of the Civil War because I'm not Ken Burns, but I will tell you the general narrative of the war. The South was doing really well in the first few years of the war, then 1863 happened, and then the North was doing really well. Got it? If you want more detail, you can go ask your uncle, because it's required by law that every American uncle must be well versed in Civil War history. I think that's true. Look it up. I'm just kidding. We'll go into a little bit more detail, but not much. So, in the early years of the war, Confederates were winning major battles. And even in battles that the Union won, they walked away with staggering casualty numbers. At Shiloh, for example, the North held the line in a sunken road known as the Hornet's Nest, but the 2-day battle eventually produced more than 23,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle in American history up until that point. For the most part, in the early years of the war, the Confederate troops were advancing. At the Battle of Second Bull Run / Second Manassas, they defeated the North again at literally the exact same spot. That's embarrassing. Fool me once, am I right? This victory allowed General Robert E. Lee to make his first invasion into the North, bringing his troops into U.S. territory. And this invasion had a few purposes. For one, he wanted to make the Northerners defend their land for a change. He also thought it would be pretty cool to capture D.C., but he also had distinctly political objectives. You see, a congressional election was coming up in the US, and Lee had hoped that if he was fighting at their doorstep, voters might elect leaders to Congress who wanted to negotiate an end to the war with the South. And across the Atlantic Ocean, Lee hoped to prove to Europe that the Confederacy was a military power, possibly enticing those desperate for Southern cotton to step in and negotiate on their behalf. Whatever the reason, the first invasion of the North ended at Antietam. With over 22,000 casualties, the one-day battle at Antietam made September 17, 1862 the bloodiest day in American history. Not to be insensitive, but it is an interesting question to wonder if the Southern Confederate soldiers should be counted as American deaths, considering they had left the US and were now fighting for a new government. But that's semantics. 3,600 people died at Antietam in just one day. For context, 2,500 U.S. soldiers died on D-Day, and 2,977 people died on September 11th. With the Union victory, the Confederates were pushed back into their own territory, and then Lincoln decided to kick the men when they were down by instantly freeing all of their slaves. I'm just kidding, that's not how that works. But just a few months after Antietam, and 60 days after issuing a warning to the South, on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Well, it theoretically went into effect. Nothing actually changed, but a lot was proclaimed. So the Emancipation Proclamation declared all slaves free. Wait, no, that's not right either. The Emancipation Proclamation declared all slaves in the Confederacy free. Wait, that's not right. All slaves in the parts of the Confederacy that were still openly fighting against the U.S., those were free. But slaves in the United States, like in the border slave states that stuck with the US, oh yeah, those American slaves were still enslaved. Lincoln needed Maryland more than enslaved people needed freedom, I guess. And also, obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation could only take effect once the North had won the war and conquered the South. But this was exactly the point. The Emancipation Proclamation, in my opinion, should be viewed entirely through the lens of wartime politics. Lincoln worried that 3 years in, his constituents and soldiers were getting tired. At some point, they were going to be like, do we even want Mississippi? I mean, really? And he was also concerned that European powers might eventually get involved, considering the blockade of the South was going really well. Global cotton prices went from 10 cents a pound in 1860 to $1.89 a pound in 1864. Side note, if you listen to season 1 of my podcast, then you remember that Egypt was cashing in on those high cotton prices, and they were spending more on industrializing than they were making from cotton, because they were like, cotton prices will never go back down. We're going to live forever. Cut to the end of the Civil War, and Southern cotton is going to flood the market, and Egypt is totally screwed. Sorry, Egypt, but I'm sure England and France will take real good care of that Suez Canal for you. Anyway, and England was getting more and more involved in our war throughout 1862. First, after 2 Confederate diplomats were forcefully taken off a British ship on their way to London, Queen Victoria admonished the United States for violating international law. Now, Lincoln wasn't too concerned until he noticed 11,000 British troops in Canada, and then he was like, oh right, I forgot y'all were still up there. Sorry, Queen Victoria. So the Emancipation Proclamation was just as much about keeping England and France, both countries that had already abolished slavery, out of the war, as much as it was about freeing the slaves. Okay, back to domestic politics. Lincoln knew that with this document, he could reinvigorate support for the war because now soldiers weren't just fighting to preserve the Union. They were fighting to transform the United States into a new, more socially conscious nation that finally figured out that slavery was bad. Now, soldiers weren't just fighters, they were liberators, and every place they conquered became a recruiting opportunity for the North to gain more soldiers from emancipated Black men. By the end of the war, over 200,000 black soldiers fought for the United States, including those who had been emancipated during the war. So by 1863, the tide is turning. First, General Grant tries his hand at some military strategy at Vicksburg, and it turns out he's pretty good. The Union Army built 15 miles of trenches to enclose Confederate troops inside Vicksburg, Mississippi, a key town right on the Mississippi River. Conditions deteriorated as no new supplies could enter the city, and residents lived underground in tunnels to escape bombardments. After almost 2 months, the Confederate forces surrendered on July 4th, 1863. Fun fact, the city of Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July out of spite for the next 81 years. And at the same moment in the South that Vicksburg was preparing to surrender, literally from July 1st to the 3rd, Union forces were stopping Lee's second invasion of the North. They fought at a town called Gettysburg. Ever heard of it? Even though Union troops won this battle, they did miss an opportunity to possibly defeat and capture Lee's army with a final attack that never came. But on July 4th, 1863, in the South, the Confederates were surrendering Vicksburg, allowing the U.S. full control of the Mississippi River. And in the North, Lee's troops were retreating back to Virginia, never to invade the North again. So 1863 is the turning point, but it's going to be 2 more years before the U.S. finally defeats the Confederacy. We've still got to capture Scarlett O'Hara, march to the sea, and meet up in Appomattox. That's right, listeners. It's another cliffhanger episode. It's not really a great cliffhanger considering you already know how this ends. I didn't really think this through. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.